But to your point about the kind of all of the acronyms, and I'm going to put a dollar bet down that CTMS and eTMF will start to merge into some kind of if we go down this path, and we in the TMF community go down this path with everybody else, because it's going to happen whether we take part or not. I think that though you could see those systems and those point systems starting to merge, because the operational management of the trial, the records that you have are the kind of one of the key kind of you have safety data, clinical data, and you've got records, right? And so I could see those two systems really merging into one operational oversight hub or something similar.
Yeah, welcome to another episode of the State of TMF. We are excited to kick off a new season with you. We've got lots of really exciting new topics to be discussed, including the one that we'll cover today. I am joined by Paul Fenton Carter, who is the CEO and founder of Montrium, and also by Nick Hargaden. I would love for each of you to introduce yourselves. Paul, I imagine that many on the line already know who you are at this point, but for those that maybe aren't aware, and also maybe some context as to why you're here to talk about the subject of today's discussion, and then we'll move on to Nick for some brief intros as well.
Sure. Thanks, Oliver, and thanks, Nick, for joining me today. So I'm Paul Fenton Carter, the CEO and founder of Montrium. Today we're going to talk about digital data flow and digital TMF and M11 and a whole bunch of different things that I feel very passionately about. I'm very much involved with CDISC and CDISC TMF reference model as part of the steering committee, and I also head up the CDISC TMF standards working group alongside with Nick. So great to be here today, and glad to see so many of you are able to join. Over to you, Nick.
Thanks. So Nick Hargaden, I'm currently clinical trials and system operations director at Moderna. I'm the system owner for our eTMF, as well as managing our TMF support operations for our portfolio of trials. History is I'm not a TMF lifer. I've been in TMF for about 6-7 years now. Before that, I've worked in a number of other clinical systems, always on the business side, kind of interfacing between the IT digital world and clinical operations teams. And similar to Paula, so I just joined the CDISC steering committee a few months ago. And context of why I'm here is, as Paul mentioned, I'm going to be hopefully helping out as we progress, moving towards a digital TMF, and also aligning us with the efforts on the digital data flow side that are already moving at speed at CDISC.
Amazing. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Paul. And I realized two things in that introduction. One, that I mispronounced your name. So sorry, Nick, I'll correct that moving forward. And the second, that we have an all British panel today, which is a first for the State of TMF. So read into that whatever you may, but we'll move on to the subject. So today's topic is really around the digital TMF, and specifically around some of the initiatives that are ongoing within the industry today that either are directly contributing or relating to this sort of the future of TMF, or are adjacent to it, specifically things like M11 and digital data flow, but also things like the TMF reference model and future versions of the reference model. So, most of today will be discussion based. If you guys have questions, please throw them into the chat. We will try and take some as we go through. The topic of today's discussion is complex and perhaps advanced or intermediate in terms of some of the topics that we'll cover. But I know that we have really, really great speakers that are going to be able to take us through this in a great way. I want to bring up just a slide that talks a little bit about these components so that Paul and Nick can kind of walk us through M11, digital data flow, and all of the other sort of stakeholders within this realm, just so that we can get a good level set, a jump off point. So Paul, maybe if I bring this slide up, do you want to sort of take us through what this means and ultimately the role that both of you are playing in trying to craft this?
Yeah, so I can get started, and this is obviously quite a busy slide, and I don't have a pointer, so I'm going to have to point you verbally in the right direction in terms of what you should be looking at. But at the heart of this, what we call the data-driven approach or digital TMF, is something that is currently being developed by ICH in collaboration with Transcelerate, and also in collaboration with CDISC, and that's ICH M11, which is a new standard. It's also obviously going to become a mandatory standard because it's being developed by ICH, and as you know, ICH is made up of the various different regulatory authorities. And what's exciting about this standard is the first time that we truly have a standard for a digital document that is really at the heart of everything else. So that obviously the protocol is an extremely important document because it really describes everything we're going to be doing within a clinical trial. And up until now, obviously, we've always had like Word versions of this document that we then had to kind of interpret to then put in place all of the processes for the trial, but also to set up all of the systems so that we could conduct the trial and collect the data. In the future, we're going to have a digital document which allows us to push out all of that protocol information to all of the various different clinical systems that we use to conduct our trial. And so those systems are things like EDC and IRT and pharmacovigilance, but also, of course, things like trial master files or eTMF and things like CTMS. And so the idea is that all systems and all organizations are using the same one version of the truth, which is digital, and it's stored centrally in what we call a study definition repository, or an SDR. And an SDR is, if you like, a bit like an online database where you can store all of these digital protocols and access them through APIs. There's also a data standard that's been developed and continues to be developed called USDMs. So USDM is the Unified Study Definitions Model, and this is a data standard that is being developed by CDISC, again in collaboration with Transcelerate and with other industry partners. And this is all about developing data standards for encoding all of the parameters, the design parameters for a clinical study that we typically see in the digital protocol as a first step. And of course, it will be expanded over time. And the idea is that all of these different clinical systems are able to read the digital protocol and also interoperate between themselves using this data standard called USDM. And this whole concept or process is called digital data flow. And that's really the project that was born out of Transcelerate, digital data flow. That is in its third phase now and about to go into its fourth. And this is really a game changer for us because all of a sudden we're all going to be working from the same version of truth, the same source, which is the digital protocol. Now, all of these clinical systems typically have TMF relevant information. So if you think about a CTMS, well, typically we have things like monitoring visit reports that exist in the CTMS. If you think about IRT, we have a whole bunch of artifacts around drug shipments, drug distribution, that kind of thing, or even randomizations that are occurring. If you think about pharmacovigilance, we have information about safety cases. If you think about EDC, we have things like CRFs that are being completed and obviously need to be part of the TMF as well. So all of these different downstream clinical systems all have information that's TMF relevant, and that information needs to end up in the TMF. And traditionally, what's happened is we would download that information into like PDF kind of format or Excel or whatever format made sense. And then we would upload it into the trial master file. Or in some cases, we would create a placeholder in the trial master file and a signpost saying, okay, well, this artifact exists, but it actually exists in the system. But it wasn't very sort of practical, and it's actually quite labor intensive to do that, because there is quite a lot of artifacts that exist in these different systems. And as we use systems more and more, that list of artifacts is growing. And so that's why this is important. If we're able to now start to interact with these clinical systems through the use of APIs and through the standards that are being developed as part of digital data flow, all of a sudden it makes it easier to start to connect these systems together and have a much more holistic approach to our trial master file. At the same time, the digital protocol is also important for eTMF because it contains study design parameters. And those study design parameters can be used to dictate what we should expect to see in our trial master file. So, for example, if we are planning interim analysis for a study, let's say there are 2 interim analysis planned, maybe based on patient recruitment levels, or it could be that they're actually planned at very specific periods in advance, then we know that we should expect to see documentation within our trial master file to document those interim analyses. And that information we can actually get directly from the digital protocol. The digital protocol tells us that interim analysis are planned. Same as, for example, number of treatment arms and what those treatment arms are. That's classic protocol information that is useful for us in the TMF, because we know that if we have, say, 3 treatment arms, well, we're going to have 3 sets of IP documentation required for the TMF. And there are many, many examples of information that we can take from the digital protocol that we can then use to be able to better define our expected artifact list or our expected document list that we typically manage manually today. We also can eventually imagine being able to navigate the trial master file by protocol. So imagine that you have a digital protocol that you could load into your trial master file system, and the digital protocol is really made up of a structure. There's different sections covering different aspects of the trial. And one of the things that we plan to do as part of the TMF reference model initiative is map artifacts to protocol sections, so that we can then look at a protocol and then we can very quickly look at a particular section of that protocol and see all of the related artifacts. And that's quite an important thing, because obviously the TMF is all about telling the stories of the study and also allowing an inspector to evaluate that study. I think I may have lost my slide. No, okay, perfect. So the TMF needs to be able to consume the digital protocol for expected document list or expected artifact list, and also to be able to navigate by protocols, but also to be able to better interconnect with the downstream clinical systems through the digital data flow process and environment. We, of course, still have EMS, so the Exchange Mechanism Standard, and the EMS, we're looking at it right now to be able to align it better with what's happening within digital data flow, because digital data flow is all about interoperability, as is EMS. And then there are also other initiatives that are about to start up within the TMF reference model around metadata standards, for example, that will have a big impact on the future of EMS. Finally, there are 2 other elements that you see on this diagram. There's control terminology. And control terminology is super important, because control terminology allows us to understand what data is. What are we looking at? What does it mean? And CDISC has been working with the National Cancer Institute for a number of years now, defining one central library of control terminology, which is applied to every single standard that CDISC manages, including the TMF reference model. And so we've already started to encode the TMF reference model with control terminology, and we're part of that ecosystem. So when we start to provide information in the future or receive information in the future, we'll be able to look at that control terminology and understand what is this information. And also what are the permitted values for this information, because you have obviously code lists within that as well. And then the last piece is the CDISC library, which is really where all of these standards are stored and managed. And again, the eTMF needs to be able to interact with this CDISC library to not only access information about the TMF reference model as it gets much larger, but also to be able to access information about other standards that are being used in other systems. So, for example, EDC standards exist, and those standards are documented in the CDISC library. So if we receive a data set or we receive information, we can understand what it is because we can consult the library and get the information we need. All of these things together will eventually contribute to improved completeness, improved timeliness, and improved quality. Improved completeness because we're going to have a lot more information, a lot more data to be able to work out exactly what we should have in our trial master file. And that's one of the biggest challenges we have today as an industry. Improved timeliness because we're going to have much better interoperability. So we're no longer going to be downloading and producing these PDFs and then uploading. It will all be interconnected. And then finally, quality, because everything will be digital. And so we can do a lot more automated verification on the information that we have to improve quality. And also, the faster we can get information, usually the faster we can detect issues and resolve them. So all in all, I think the future is pretty interesting. It's pretty bright, and these things are no longer a pipe dream. They're really in motion. These things are happening. And we as an industry are now mobilizing to ensure that TMF is also part of this and that we can realize this data-driven approach. And I'm going to pause there because I know that was a lot of information, but that's what it is in a nutshell.
Thank you, Paul. So I know that was obviously a lot to consume, and certainly we're not expecting you guys to have listened to every detail of that and sort of go away and know exactly what we're talking about. So we're going to jump into a little bit more of a dialogue and back and forth where I'm going to pick the brain of Paul and Nick to try and sort of dive into some of these sections and areas in a little bit more detail. Paul, I think you covered a lot there, as well as some of the the impacts. But I wanted to come to you, Nick. Obviously working more on the sponsor side, specifically within systems, but also within TMF. What does this promise? What does this bring? How does this change the way that your teams will work, both from a sponsor perspective, but perhaps also how you'll work with CROs?
Yes, I think obviously with this kind of caveat that this is a long-term project, right? This isn't something that's going to change in 2025. So we're looking kind of really into the future, into that kind of next generation of clinical records management, really. I think a big piece of this is us getting ready as a community, just as data management did 10, 20, 25 years ago now, where they moved from paper CRFs where there were multi-part paper and the CRAs would bring the paper back and there would be manual data entry of all of the data, double data entry, to a world where the data is being captured on a browser and a site and go directly into a central database. So change their world from one of paper management to data management, true data management for end to end. And I think what does this bring for us? I think one of the impacts is going to be over time is how we're going to need to adapt, right? And we initially we were managing paper file rooms. Then it moved to essentially what is now our eTMFs, our electronic document management, but it's still a file room kind of structure, and the reference model is kind of conceptually built out that way. And that's how we think about everything that we do. And I think everything that Paul is talking about moves us more towards seeing it all as data in the long run, right? And the digital protocol is just that first example of, well, now it's structured data. How could we use it in our systems and our processes? And the more we make the TMF like that as a digital TMF, how much of that data can we share with other groups in the clinical trial ecosystem to inform trial health, and really look very different in the long term from where we are today, I think.
So maybe let's unpack that a little bit. Outside of, we've got an audience here that's very TMF focused, right? But what we're talking about here isn't TMF exclusive. So what are some of the functions that are outside of TMF that are potentially impacted by this? and what are some of the things that we might see change for the better in those other areas as these things start to uncover? If that's a question for anyone.
I can maybe start with my thoughts. I'm pretty sure Nick has thoughts too, but I think that what we're trying to do here is we're trying to move from a filing in a repository type mentality to more of a this is a really useful set of information that can help me do my job better on a day-to-day basis. So more of an active or proactive type environment. And if you think about the TMF, it really is a gold mine of information that is kind of locked up today because it's all locked in documents and it's just really not very, the content itself is not very structured. It's difficult for us to leverage it for operational purposes. But I think more and more as we move towards standardization, we move more and more towards data versus documents, and we have much better interoperability, then all of a sudden the TMF will change from being this sort of stale old repository based on a paper filing system into much more of an operational management system that is almost akin to CTMS, that tells you what's going on in the study and allows you to make better decisions. And I think that's really the goal that we're trying to get towards. We're trying to create value with the TMF so that people want to work in the TMF. They want to look at the TMF. They it's part of their day to day. And by doing that, I think we can improve, all of our metrics, right? Completeness, because people are going to want to contribute information, the quality of the information, because they're quite dependent on it. And quite quickly, they'll be able to see if there's a problem, right? If they're using it in their day-to-day operations, and then timeliness, of course. And then the cherry on the top is you get to inspection time and you've got something that's probably a lot more inspection ready than it would be in today's world, where it's much more of it's almost like an afterthought still. So that's kind of my thoughts on it.
Nice. Nick, anything to add there from your perspective?
No, I think that's spot on. I think that from a sponsor point of view as well, one observation actually from what you just said, Paul, was that, the first thing in an inspection that the inspector asks for is the keys to the TMF, right? And of course, I think kind of culturally, we build it for the inspector at the end. And of course, that's why we have so many challenges from a completeness and timeliness point of view, because we aren't using, as you say, actively using it for our own kind of oversight. And I think as a sponsor, and to those of us in the TMF community, I think it's pretty much the standard model at this point for companies beyond a certain size and maturity point, is you're holding the TMF centrally yourself, right? So you may have lots of your services outsourced to CROs and other vendors, and they're creating content. We have to get that inside because we want it in-house. And if you kind of get to it's an active operational management tool, which is really where it could be, then it also means this movement towards digitization and towards integrating all of these systems and the digital data flow will get us the tools we need to automatically move all this content inside, so we have it on time, so we can use it. And so those two things really mesh neatly, I think, with challenges that we have today and opportunities that we could realize tomorrow.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's interesting, right? Because, as you mentioned at the beginning, Nick, this isn't a sort of something that we're going to see unfold in front of us tomorrow. It's going to take time. And it sort of just makes me think about how far we've already come in the TMF space. And so if you fast forward sort of 10, 15 years into the future where what we're talking about here is common practice, someone who's been in TMF for a while mentions to a TMF associate that just joined that they used to manage this in a filing cabinet. They just wouldn't believe you, which I just think is quite interesting to see how the evolution of these things will, completely change the way that we work.
I mean, when I started my career in the late 90s, I was in data management and we were doing paper CRFs and double data entry, as Nick said, and that I kind of got nostalgic when he started talking about it. The good old days, but it's completely transformed today. And now we're even doing sort of integrations with electronic health records and all of that stuff. And TMF is it's a slow developer, we're at where data management was at 15 years ago. So we're kind of at the beginning of that digitization journey. But I think that a lot of the things we learn with the digitization of data management, we can apply to TMF, and so it could go a lot faster.
Absolutely. What sort of impact do you think this has on the vendor ecosystem, right? Like we're so used to talking about all these different acronyms, right? EDC, CTMS, eTMF, everything at this point. What impact does that have on these systems? Do we start to see some of these categories completely redefined? What does that look like?
It definitely, there's obviously a lot of work that will go into, from a technology point of view, right, to transform how those systems are structured and how they interact with other systems, right? Because they were built around most of the systems that we use were built around that kind of document management model. Right. But to your point about the kind of all of the acronyms, and I'm going to put a dollar bet down that CTMS and eTMF will start to merge into some kind of if we go down this path, and we in the TMF community go down this path with everybody else, because it's going to happen whether we take part or not. I think that though you could see those systems and those point systems starting to merge, because operational management of the trial, the records that you have are the kind of one of the key kind of you have safety data, clinical data, and you've got records, right? And so I could see those two systems really merging into one operational oversight hub or something similar.
Yeah. In the other area that is interesting is also, I totally agree with what you said, by the way, Nick. But the other area as well that I think is going to start to get a lot more attention is quality management, because obviously with ICH E6R3, there's this requirement that we start to take a more quality by design approach to things. And one thing that today we don't do is we don't make a connection between our quality management system and our trial master file. Very rarely do we do that, because the quality management system ultimately defines this is how we should conduct our trials, right? In your SOPs. And at the same time, the trial master file is, well, this is how we conducted our trial. So this is how we're going to conduct, and this is how we did it. And those two things really need to be connected together. And then we should also be evaluating, well, did we do what we said we were going to do? You know, and if we can connect these two things together, we can start to evaluate that very clearly. Because when an inspection happens, the inspector is looking at sort of several things, obviously compliance with regulations, compliance with the protocol, but they're also looking at compliance with your SOPs and your policy system.
Right.
And that's sometimes where there's a disconnect. So I think that in the future we'll start to see a much more integrated or more global operational system which has quality built into it, as our processes should. And also a system that will allow us to start to monitor and evaluate digitally compliance. So compliance with the quality system. If we have a digital quality system that's integrated, we can evaluate compliance. Are we doing what we should be doing? Are we doing it in the correct sequence? Are we doing it in a timely manner? Mm-hmm. And are we producing evidence that's required by our quality system? And it's the same deal with the protocol, right? We can also start to evaluate compliance with the protocol if it's digital. So there's a lot of opportunities there to start to evaluate compliance, detect potential issues, and deal with them before the inspector arrives. And so I think that we'll still have QMS, we'll still have eTMF, we'll still have EDC, but I think that the connections will start to get much closer and much more integrated.
Right. And I guess to Nick's point, the scope of a TMF or an eTMF system is expanding, right? It's expanding into those other areas that we're used to today. Interesting, some comments in the chat also talking about sort of the regulatory impact, and this is somewhere I wanted to go next, right? So, if we think about the evolution of the technology system, we're looking at the changing the way that we work, looking to be more data focused. What sort of impact does this have from a regulatory perspective, specifically within evaluation, right, and review, and sort of the traditional inspection environment that we find ourselves in today? Who wants to take that one?
I can Nick take that.
Okay.
Well, Nick deals with this spaces all the time. So.
There you go, Nick. So give us your perspective there from a regulatory perspective.
I think that what comes to mind is, and this is, I'm coming from a position of some ignorance here, and because I'm going to talk a bit about what CDISC did. But one of the biggest things that happened with the CDISC standards that were built out for clinical data was moving from delivering reams and reams of paper to FDA or EMA, etc., to you need to provide with a standardized data set that we can consume and look at ourselves, right? And I think that, again, not tomorrow, but I think the trend toward it has been, and you see this particularly, the classic is that you see it with Europe and the UK, is self-service access to the eTMF, right? And so that's really helped push us into standardization in the reference model across the industry, because they want to be able to go in and understand the eTMF quickly, not have to worry about understanding that you did it differently because your organization has, XYZ special needs of standards or whatever it is. I think that next step will be, well, what if they just want to go into the eTMF whenever they want to go into the eTMF?
Yeah.
That is potentially the longer term picture of this. Is you could be inspected at any time, those records could be available at any time, and therefore you need to be, obviously our biggest challenge from that point of view is completeness and quality, but in that future world you could see where if it's standardized enough they could just consume data as they need it, right? They could information from the eTMF in the same way that the CDISC standards have allowed them to do that with clinical data. And
exactly. And I think that is that's an important factor and an important reason why the TMF reference model became part of CDISC, because CDISC obviously has the experience and the relationships with the regulators when it comes to implementing standards that are going to be acceptable. And I think that the reference model always struggled to get the recognition it required from the regulators, primarily because it wasn't a formal standard. And also because there's so much variability when it comes to trial master file, because there's a lot of variability when it comes to trial design. And so I think that one thing that CDISC is doing for us as the reference model and as a community is that they're pushing us down that standardization route, which eventually will end up producing something that will probably be quite palatable to the regulators, especially if, as Nick said, they want to be able to access whenever they want. They want to be able to consume the information very quickly and easily and evaluate the information within the trial master file on an ongoing basis. And I think that one of our objectives as a reference model as well is to get regulatory recognition and to be mandated by the regulators, to be mandated by ICH as the standard that we should be following when it comes to trial master file content and trial master file structure. So I think it's definitely on the cards. They've already kind of started doing it. I've heard stories where some of the European agencies will request access for 4 or 5 months at a time, which traditionally, I suppose, is quite a scary thought for a lot of sponsors, because it's how do I know what they're looking at? Is everything there? Does it kind of expose me as people add more content to the TMF? It's definitely of concern, but I think there are different ways of looking at it. If you put in place good processes and you're able to ensure that something becomes final only when it's truly final, it's gone through all of the proper QC and everything else, then why should you be worried about what the regulatory authority is going to think? Right. And I think it also needs to be like a two-way street. The regulatory authority also needs to be understanding that sometimes what things could end up in there that don't necessarily need to be in there or shouldn't be in there or not quite right. And there needs to be a little bit of leniency and flexibility there too. So I think it's a joint effort, but I think that if we can start to work more closely with ICH and the regulatory authorities, then we can come up with something that's going to work for both parties.
Yeah, I was going to ask, I mean, does that sort of the potential of this all-time, anytime, on-demand access make you nervous, Nick? And what would you obviously this is still very early days, but are there things that you guys are already thinking about from a sponsor perspective that will help you be less nervous about those types of things in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a right now and a longer term future, and there's already a huge part of our energy, as mine and my team's clinical trial team's energy goes into finding ways to best measure how healthy our TMF is at any point in time, right? And I think that's actually evolved for sure, even in the time that I've been involved from a very QC centered model to much more now cross-functional involvement of the different, getting people to own their content, which is enormously helpful. So I think all of that will continue to go on, and it's a natural push and pull, I guess, as the regulators kind of set new requirements or start speaking about things, directions they want to go in. Well, that forces us to be innovative and solve problems, right? So I can't really predict, in that longer term, I think it's two things. You either make the content being in the TMF something that people need, which is that becoming an active oversight tool, right? Mm-hmm. Then it will become something that will happen just because it needs to happen for the users themselves, as being right at the end of their process when all of the work of their job is filing. Mm-hmm. And then the other part of it is, I think, the opportunities that Paul kind of talked about at the beginning, which is stop the filing happening in the first place, right? So stop it being a manual process of moving content from A to B, and tightly integrate those systems so that it's just there. Or it's just, if it's not there, then data about it is available in your eTMF, so that it's been filed in the other repository, or whether it be a safety system or whatever. But that's the other way I think you can go in that kind of longer term. But I'm not concerned. I think that what I've seen with the TMF community is it's hugely collaborative and very inventive, and I think that if we go in that direction, the regulators go in that direction, I think that the community is going to step up.
And Paul, do you think that the regulatory bodies, the inspectors, the folks that are going to be involved in actually actively reviewing this material, like you said, do you think that there's going to be some leniency, I guess they're going to take into account that this is new and different and changing, or do you feel like it's going to be, these are the expectations?
I think it will be collaborative. It has to be. And in fact, I think in general, the regulatory authorities tend to be collaborative. And like anything new, there's always kind of a teething period, right? So there may be issues because it is a bit of a change in mindset. But I think that there's definite benefits. There's benefits to the regulators because we're going to provide them with something that's number one, much more structured, easier to understand, connected up, if you like. They're not going to have to do all of that groundwork that they've typically done. Because today when they come in to perform an inspection, they end up spending a lot of time searching for information and trying to put it all together before they can start to evaluate it. So a lot of that stuff, we're hoping that we can do all of that up front so that they have things that are readily available to them. And then I think, as they look at things, they need to be realistic that they're looking at something that's live, and that's evolving, and there are processes at play to ensure quality and completeness and timeliness. But we don't live in a perfect world, and things can go wrong, and they do go wrong, and I think they're realistic, about that. The good thing about this being sort of spearheaded by CDISC is CDISC has those relationships, has that dialogue, has a good working relationship with ICH and the regulators. And so I think we're not there yet, and we're actually quite far from there. But once we start to get to a place where we've got enough standardization to be a more serious candidate for mandating by the regulators, then I think there'll definitely be good discussions. And I think that CDISC will be really pivotal in making sure that, whatever is decided is going to be beneficial and fair to everybody and usable, And that's what they did, obviously, with the clinical data side of things, with SDTM and ADAM and all the rest. It was definitely a collaboration with the regulators and with ICH.
And we talked a lot about, Paul, you mentioned sort of the how this reaches into connecting quality processes, and Nick, you talked about other clinical processes. Obviously, a lot of what we do and the output of what we do is contained in a regulatory submission. How do you see things like this bleeding into the kind of the regulatory submission process, commercializing, etc.?
There's definite overlap, obviously, between the two, and I think that we'll probably see more automation between content that is being sort of generated or collected within eTMF that eventually needs to end up in a submission and submitted to the regulatory authorities. I also think that we were talking about direct access by the regulators. There's the M2 group, which manages the ECTD standard, which is an ICH standard. I think that they definitely also have interest in other systems that touch submission content, and one of those is eTMF. So they've already kind of looked at things, and I think that they would probably get involved at some point as we move more towards the standard. But yeah, definitely the submission is almost like, it's almost the end point, right? It's where you're trying to get to that final NDA or BLA. And I think that, when we look at the overall ecosystem, we should be sort of thinking also about our overall process. So how do we get from IND to NDA, and how does all of those pieces work together? And that's what digital data flow is kind of all about as well. Right. So ECTD is part of it. And if you look at it's this kind of like this, it's almost like an underground map or a subway map that CDISC often presents of their vision of where everything's going. And obviously ECTD is part of that.
No, wonderful. All right. So we're sort of coming to the end of this discussion. We've covered a lot already. I want to talk about some of the challenges that you guys think we'll face as we start to try and implement some of these things. What do you think are some of the biggest hurdles that we're likely to face as we start to implement things like M11, digital data flow, and the ultimate sort of vision for digital TMF?
But with vendor, I think there's definitely challenges because we have to kind of rethink things in terms of how our systems function. There's also going to be a lot more detail, as we start to develop metadata standards, as we start to formalize sub-artifacts and things like that. As we start to create more interoperability with other systems, it definitely changes the technical landscape. And so one thing that's really important is the vendors need to be at the heart of this alongside, the sponsors and CROs. They need to be at the table because ultimately they're the ones that are going to have to do a lot of the legwork to put this in place technically. So definitely there are lots of changes coming for the vendor community. But I think that there's definite interest and there's a willingness to collaborate from what I see. And obviously I interact a lot with other vendors too. So big challenge, but I think, as a vendor community, we're up for the challenge because we know it's time to change.
Nick, from your perspective, the sponsor perspective, maybe even the CRO perspective, what are some of the challenges there?
Yeah, so just want to echo, totally agree about where the vendors need to be at the heart of this. And I think that sponsors and CROs, because they're customers too, we have a role to play there in kind of pushing that, right? Pushing that message that this is where we need to go. And it always helps if the regulators are also on that, on board that train. I do think about it in terms of change management for us, for everybody involved in TMF, CRO, sponsor. It's going to be in the longer term, it's going to be a very different kind of business process or a quality system that we work within. But I suppose most immediately, I think what a lot of people will be thinking about is, as we specify the model into the reference model and the standard, we move towards being a true standard in CDISC, is, are we going to have to compromise on individual differences in how one company operates versus another? And that's already something that exists as a sponsor working with CROs, because they'll have their standards and configurations and systems, processes, etc. You have to map them on what you need. So we already kind of live in that world. And I do know that people are going to be, we're all going to be concerned about that. I think that there's going to be some sacrifice or some compromise there, but also, you just have to keep your eye on the prize of the longer term benefits from that. But yeah, that I think is probably going to be one of our most immediate short-term change management kind of problems to solve.
Love it. Last question for you. There's probably lots and lots of people that are listening today that are wondering how they can best prepare for it, how they can get involved in it. So to both of you, what are some of the things that you guys would recommend for folks that are looking to learn a little bit more, to get perhaps involved, or to be privy to the information as it's coming? What's the recommendation?
I'll quickly say, before the kind of outside of the get involved piece in the actual initiatives themselves, maybe Paul, you want to speak to that, but you can get involved in your organization. So, some of this is about starting to think about your world as about data and not about documents, right? It's what's the data inside those documents. And so some of that is just self-education, look to that future, get involved in data governance in your organization, make sure that your TMF or eTMF is part of that conversation. If you have data governance going on, and then start reading. Big piece of this is go read go look at Transcelerate's website and the history of the digital data flow. Go look at the M11 draft standard digital protocol. It'll make a lot more sense once you do. And some of this technical, no question on the defining the standards and the SDR repository and all of the things at CDISC, but you can definitely start looking at a lot of that, learn a lot, and start to get a real picture of where you could be contributing in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there's also there are events that happen. Obviously, CDISC hold events. There are webinars. There are other organizations that also put together online events similar to this. So definitely go to those as well. So educate yourself, as Nick said. And then also, get involved, because this is something, there's a whole bunch of new initiatives that are going to be launched shortly. And obviously I can't give too much away, but next week, in fact, in Arizona, there'll be a number of sessions talking about these new initiatives. And so volunteer, get involved as an industry. If you're not a CDISC volunteer, go and register on the website, say what you're interested in, where you think you can contribute. And as we said earlier, it's, we need all stakeholders here. It's not just sponsors, it's not just CROs, not just vendors, regulators. We need everybody to come together to realize the vision. So there's a lot to be done. And I think, the sooner we roll up our sleeves, the better. So,
what an exciting prospect, and obviously a really interesting movement for the industry. As Paul, you mentioned, there are a number of presentations next week. You can visit Montrium, as well as everybody else that's going to be at the CDISC and TMF US interchange in Arizona. We've had lots of questions. I've tried to ask them in my own way as we've gone through today's discussion. I want to thank you, Paul, and you, Nick, for joining us. Thanks everybody for joining. We'll be back again in about 3 weeks' time for another episode. The topic and what we will be discussing, who the guests are, etc., will be released very, very shortly. Thank you again, Nick, Paul. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I'll see you on the next one.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the State of TMF. If you liked today's episode, hit the subscribe button, view the full episode with video on YouTube, and follow us on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook to see the sometimes entertaining and always resourceful content we post every single day. Thank you for tuning in, and see you next month on the next episode.